welcome to the original Gangsters Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein. I want to unveil a new segment that we're going to have here at the OG Pod. I want to make some announcements about the future of the OG Pod, and then I'm going to deep dive some content. So this is the first in a series of OG Histories that we're going to start doing. We're going to break the YouTube content into kind of three slices right now: OG Histories, OG Editorials, and then OG Breaking News. We are getting rid of the quick hitters. I think it's a bit redundant at this point. I can tell that interest in some of the more minutia news is even kind of too niche for the niche. And you're going to get that blow by blow, minute by minute, day by day stuff in written content at my Gangster Report site. So we're going to eliminate the quick hitters, and we're going to go back to kind of longer form content. The quick hitters were between 5 and 15 minutes. Everything that you're going to be consuming now, for the most part, will be 20, 25 minutes or longer. Long form interviews will continue to be posted here at Original Gangsters Pod, and I got a couple real good ones in the hopper. But that's kind of the announcement I want to make. And with no further ado, this is going to be the first edition of OG History. And today we're going to drill down on the history between the Philadelphia Mafia and New York's five families. There's been a lot of debate in the last year and a half with the Skinny Joey Merlino podcasting controversy about what New York and what the five families can and cannot do in regards to a group like Philadelphia that's in theory outside of their purview. But I think if we go back and look at the history of that relationship over the last 3/4 of a century, let's just kind of go from post-World War II into modern times, you'll see that pretty much every leadership decision, shift, changeover has been either chimed in on or at the direction of the five families, the commission. And it's like clockwork. You look back historically and you look back at every leadership change, and New York played some role. So if we're going to talk about what can and cannot be done in 2025, I think you're in pretty good shape if you use history, as a compass. And just shouting out Gangland News and Jerry Capacey, they Capacey reported last year, based on some of the reporting that we had done before that Philadelphia had put Joey Merlino on the shelf after 3 decades of Merlino leading that family, that with counsel and pressure and advice being given by New York, Philadelphia, vis-a-vis current boss Georgie Borghese, decided to put Joey Merlino on the shelf for his podcasting, social media endeavors that have ruffled a lot of feathers. And since then, there's been subsequent debate about protocol and what New York can and cannot do. So without really addressing that question, let's just talk about history and what we know has been done historically. So you can go back again, if we're going to talk about post World War II into the 2020s, you're going to begin with Joe Ida, who took power in 1946 and replaced Joe Dovey, who they called Joe Bruno, who went by the name Joe Bruno, but his real name was Joe Dovey. He passed away, natural causes. Joe Ida replaced him. Joe Ida was very, very, very close to Vito Genovese, the Genovese crime family, and the Mangano crime family that would go on to become the Gambinos in the coming years. And Ida got the job as boss of the Philly Mafia because of his close relationship to Genovese and other guys in New York. The commission appointed Joe Ida. Ida would leverage his close relationship with Vito Genovese and get Philadelphia a seat on the commission. About a decade later, there was talk that Vito Genovese at one point wanted to officially absorb Philadelphia and basically annex them, to use a term for our modern day political parlance. And that was eventually nixed. But Joe Ida was very close to Vito Genovese, and the Genovese and the Manganos emboldened Ida. Ida was at Appalachian. Then he, facing legal problems, he takes off, goes home, back to Europe, and New York helps decide who's going to take his place, and it's decided it's going to be Antonio Polina, aka Mr. Miggs. But pretty quickly, Carlo Gambino, who takes over the Mangano Anastasia organization, it becomes the Gambino crime family. Carlo Gambino goes on to become, what's known as the boss of bosses, kind of the head of the commission, de facto head of the commission. And Miggs is worried about Angelo Bruno and decides to put a hit out on Angelo Bruno, who at the time was a skipper, not realizing that Bruno's relationship with Gambino and other powers in New York were going to stop that in its tracks. And the guys that Polina gave the contract to, go and tip off Bruno, and Angelo Bruno goes to New York, and Carlo Gambino steps in, and the contract's lifted, and Miggs is deposed, and Carlo Gambino decides to gets the commission to allow him to put Angelo Bruno into power. And that's how Bruno got into power. It was his close relationship, his friendship, the trust he had with Carlo Gambino, who at that point was early on in his reign, but would go on to become the boss of bosses, or could have been the bosses of bosses at that point. Could have been the boss of bosses at that point. So Angelo Bruno was very influenced by Carlo Gambino, kind of, I guess, in a similar way that Joe Ida had been influenced by Vito Genovese. And Angelo Bruno allows Carlo Gambino quite a bit of leeway in terms of territory. Carlo Gambino puts his cousins, the Cherry Hill Gambinos, right in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia. Major drug dealing operation based out of Cherry Hill. And those weren't Philly guys. Those were Carlo Gambino's guys that were living and working in Angelo Bruno's territory. Obviously, Angelo Bruno was taking a piece of it, and at the same time telling people, other people he didn't want them drug dealing, caused issues for him later on. But another thing that we know, Carlo Gambino, the Cherry Hill Gambinos, the Castellano and that regime after Gambino died in 1976, they put John Stanfa with Angelo Bruno. But John Stanfa came over from Sicily in the 1970s. He didn't go to New York. He went to Philadelphia. He didn't know anybody in Philadelphia. He went there because the Gambinos put him with Angelo Bruno. And we know how that turned out. We'll get to that in a second. So, at least in terms of Bruno, New York they were almost a shadow government in terms of Angelo Bruno was ostensibly the boss of Philadelphia, no strings attached, but Carlo Gambino was using him for a lot of things, making a lot of money off him in his territory. So Carlo Gambino dies in 1976, and that exposes Angelo Bruno and the forces within the Philadelphia Mafia. The sharks smell blood, and a lot of stuff that people were angry at Angelo Bruno about, and animosities and tensions that were festering underneath the surface began to elevate above the surface with Carlo Gambino being gone. The guys that Bruno had around him didn't love him. He had his loyalists, but his underboss, Phil Testa, really didn't love Angelo Bruno. The distaste for Angelo Bruno didn't make Phil Testa want to make a move. But there was really no love lost there. Testa felt like Bruno did not trust him the way a boss should trust an underboss, and didn't empower him the way a boss should empower an underboss. And definitely Tony Bananas, Antonio Caponegro, who became his consigliere in 1977 when Joe Regnetta died, was the wrong choice, and plotted and then eventually did kill Angelo Bruno. Brings us back to New York. Tony Bananas would have never made that move if he didn't think, he was wrong, but if he didn't think he had the sign off, the permission, the sanctioning of what at that point was known as the commission. And specifically, now we've gone from the Genovese to the Gambinos, and now we're back to the Genovese. So Tony Bananas was talking and getting what he thought were valid marching orders from Frank Thierry, Fonzie Thierry, who was one of the front bosses, acting bosses of the Genovese. But Thierry was on some Machiavellian shit and was playing Tony Bananas. And Tony Bananas, again, thought that he had the okay to launch a palace coup, an insurgence, plot the assassination of Angelo Bruno, which he did with the help of John Stanfa, who had been, again, put in by the Gambinos. Presumably, I believe that Stanfa was a co-conspirator. I guess it's never really been proven, but I'm confident in reporting that Stanfa was a co-conspirator. He was driving the car Angelo Bruno was sitting in when he got his head blown off in March 21st, 1980. And Tony Bananas thought he was going to be crowned the Mafia king of South Philly and North Jersey. Tony Bananas was the Philadelphia mob skipper in Newark. But he had been manipulated, and the rest of the commission, the rest of Genovese, had never agreed to kill Angelo Bruno. The Gambinos were livid, and Tony Bananas and his brother-in-law, Freddie Salerno, a couple capos, Frank the Barracuda Sindone and Johnny Key Simone, all paid with their lives for what was thought to be a for lack of a better term, a kosher gangland assassination where they had gotten the okay to do it, but they didn't. It was smoke and mirrors. They paid with their lives. Interjecting New York again in exacting vengeance for what thought to be a sanction, but was actually an unsanctioned assassination of Angelo Bruno. Johnny Key Simone was taken out by the Gambinos. Sindone was killed by his own guys in Philly. Freddie Salerno and Tony Caponegro were killed by Genovese hit team after they were called to a meeting that Tony Bananas thought he was going to be given the crown, when in reality he was killed. But in that situation in 1980, spring of 1980, Philadelphia was not doing their own house cleaning. New York was. They killed most of the conspirators. Sammy the Bull has talked about the Johnny Keys hit, how he didn't even know who Johnny Keys was. Never met the guy, didn't know who the guy was, but had been assigned, and that they had to hold him in a van for a couple hours until there was basically a meeting being held about whether Johnny Keys was going to be allowed to just leave town or if he was going to be killed. And Gravano talked about how much he respected Johnny Keys in those couple hours, and they spoke. And then when the word came down that Johnny Keys had to be killed, Sammy the Bull afforded him the opportunity to take off his shoes, which is a old Sicilian tradition that if you have respect, kind of like a samurai who's allowed to fall on his sword. If you're a guy that's been marked for death, but there's still people that respect you, and you just made a move that when you made a roll of the dice that turned out against you, they'll show you respect and let you take off your shoes. So Sammy Gravano let Johnny Keys take off his shoes before he killed him. It was a sign of respect. And he's told that story about how much even though he only knew the guy for a couple hours and he ended up killing the guy, how much respect he had. And that story's been in Mafia lore since Sammy wrote that book 35 years ago. So it's a well-known example of New York coming into Philadelphia and doing some of Philly's own house cleaning for them. You move up through the 80s. Well, not even up to you move up less than a year. And Angelo Bruno's successor is underboss Phil Testa, who gets put into place with the help of New York. He's assassinated in another unsanctioned palace coup by his underboss Pete Casella, who got together with Chicky Narducci, and they thought they could make it look like Testa's problem with the Irish Roofers Union led to his murder, pretend like they had nothing to do with it, and then do a little end around and take over the family. Didn't work. They killed Testa, go to New York or pretend to go to New York, come back, tell the Philly family, hey, we didn't know anything about Testa, about the bomb and Testa's front porch. They had nothing to do. We had nothing to do with it. We got the okay from New York. Well, Nicky Scarfo, Testa's best friend and consigliere, says, hey, not so quick there, guys. I'm close with New York. He was close with the Genovese. I'm going to go make sure what you're telling us is the truth. And it wasn't. And Scarfo politicked his way with his close relationship with the Chin, Vincent Gigante, Bobby Manna, and Casella was exiled. Narducci was killed. And Nicky Scarfo took power. If it wasn't for the Chin, I don't know what would happen. Nicky Scarfo might not have been boss. So again, another situation where New York steps up and inserts itself into Philly mob leadership business. Scarfo was very close to the Chin and Bobby Manna. Again, I think for the last year or two of his reign, he got close to Gotti. He goes down in 87, convicted in 89. There's a leadership void. And who decides who's the new boss of Philly? Was it the guys in Philly? No, it wasn't. It was the Gambino crime family from New York who brings John Stanfa back from, a decade gone of doing some prison time for contempt, hiding out in Maryland, laying low from the people that wanted vengeance for his role in Angelo Bruno's unsanctioned murder. But the Gambinos make it right, and they come in, tell Philly, John Stanfa is your new Don. Everybody knows how well that played. Stanfa was very out of touch. He was looked at as a carpetbagger, looked at as an outsider trying to come in and throw weight around. He only had the backing of New York. He didn't really have the support of the rank and file. And then that provides the opportunity for Joey Merlino to come in as a young Turk in his late 20s, him and Mikey Chang, with the help of Ralph Natale behind bars. They find an opening to challenge Stanfa and his Gambino-backed regime, who at the time was actually being backed by the Colombos as well, and the Lucchese's, and build the reputation that he has today. Joey Merlino is the Joey Merlino we know now because of the war he fought in the 1990s for power in that crime family, the war that he won. Him and his Young Turks crew, those guys that we've talked about quite a while, and people make fun of me. I always say they've been thick as thieves since they were in the sandbox, since they were in elementary school. Those guys fought their way to power in Philly over about a 5-year period. But how did they do that? Well, they had to politic. They hooked up with Ralph Natale, who had been another Bruno guy who was away for about 15 years, had been a labor fixer and bodyguard hitman for Angelo Bruno, who met Joey Merlino when they were both locked up in, I think, 89, 90. They were cellmates together, and they hatch a plan to take on John Stanfa. They say John Stanfa shouldn't be recognized. He's a Sicilian, leading an American crime family, doesn't have the support of the majority of what was known at that point, started to be known as the Bruno Scarfo family. And he was only really put in there because of his ties to New York, his ties to the other side in Sicily. And Ralph Natale and Joey Merlino and Mikey Chang begin to circle the wagons and network. And Natale behind bars, that decade and a half, it was 14 years, I think, 15 years. It makes a lot of connections with guys in New York. The Chin, Andy Mush Russo, some other guys, and gets the backing to oppose Stanfa. And then when Stanfa goes to prison in 94, and Ralph Natale and Joey Merlino take over the Philly mob, they can say, maybe John Stanfa was backed by the Gambinos, but we're backed by the Chin. We're backed by the Persicos. And that's what happened. And I know there were some meetings that Ralph went to in New York to cement those relationships with the Genovese and with the Colombos. And by the end of the 1990s, Ralph is on the outs with Merlino and his guys. Ralph decides to join Team USA when he's locked up in 99. And Joey Merlino needs, this came out in court filings, court records. Joey Merlino needs friends in New York to come in and solidify his role as the boss now that Ralph Natale's gone. And even though Joey had been running the show for the most part on kind of an unofficial Don basis for the previous 4 or 5 years, he was officially underboss, but he was becoming a boss, and he needed sanctioning from New York, backing from New York. And because of his issues with Nicky Scarfo and Nicky Scarfo Jr., the Lucchese's, who Nicky was close with and who made his son, Nicky Jr., they were trying to block Merlino's ascension. The Gambinos were trying to block Merlino's ascension. Certain parts of the Genovese were trying to block Merlino's ascension. We know there was a murder plot in early 2000 where the Gambinos and the Jersey faction of the Genovese were going to kill Joey Merlino's top three guys. Joe Legambi, Georgie Borghese, Stevie Mazzone were going to be killed in a conspiracy led by Philadelphia mob Jersey skipper Pete the Crumb Caprio, got together with some Gambinos and some Genovese, and they were going to, Joey Merlino was in prison. Joey Merlino was in prison at that point, but they were going to kill his top three guys on the street, tell Joey that, stay in prison, don't come home, and we're going to take everything over. They had backing from New York to do this. Luckily for Joe Legambi and for Georgie and Stevie, Pete the Crumb got indicted and flipped and told everyone about this plan. But again, Merlino still needed sanctioning. And that sanctioning came from none other than Barney Bellomo and the Chin, who were both alive, but they were incarcerated. But they sent word in 2000 that the question of whether or not Joey Merlino is recognized as boss of Philadelphia is no longer a question. We are recognizing him. We're the top spot. Genovese, the Ivy League, the elite of the elite. That's where the most juice is, and we're putting this question to bed. So Barney and the Chin made Joey, and that brings us, into current times where there's been issues between Merlino and the bosses in New York. Bellomo, Barney is reportedly personally offended, feels betrayed because of the fact that he feels embarrassed. That's whatever, the fact that he stuck his neck out for Joey Merlino back in 2000, and he feels like Merlino owes him something and owes him not to become a podcaster, not to be putting our thing business into their thing, YouTube or Patreon or what have you. So again, I know I'm just wrapping it up now. As I, wrapping it around from where we started, and we said there's been a lot of debate and questioning over the past year and a half about what New York can and cannot do in regards to Philadelphia. I want to point out, though, that some of the questioning is the people questioning are conflating what people think and what was actually reported. Jerry Capacey and Gangland News, and frankly, me and Original Gangsters Podcast and the Gangster Report, nobody's ever reported that New York has done any. We've reported that New York has influenced the decisions of the people in Philadelphia. That's true, but I saw a headline the other day from a podcasting site that was saying, New York can't shelve Joey Merlino. Nobody said New York shelved Joey Merlino. Jerry Capacey did not report that. Jerry Capacey reported that Georgie Borghese shelved Joey Merlino, that Philadelphia shelved Joey Merlino. Now, were they being pressured by New York? Yes. But that was a delineation that was made very clear in Jerry's report in August of 2024, that the final decision came from Philadelphia and Georgie Borghese. My reporting was that before the shelving, Merlino did not get kicked off the throne. New York did not pull him off the throne. My reporting is that Joey stepped down. He voluntarily stepped down from the throne. to focus on his podcasting and his social media. He knew the shitstorm that he had created, and he wanted to step away from it. He didn't want it to splatter all over Georgie Borghese and Stevie Mazzone and those guys. So he stepped away. They restructured. Was it being influenced by New York? Yeah, it was. Was New York chiming in? Yeah. But did New York make the decision? No, they did not. So again, let's make sure we know what is reported and what people kind of want to say that other people are making the narrative. So, my reporting, piggybacking off of Jerry's reporting, who piggybacked off my reporting. Jerry broke the news of the shelving. I think even Jerry might not have understood that there were two separate situations. There was the September 2023, a month or so after the podcast launched, and Joey Merlino voluntarily stepped down as boss of the Philadelphia Mob after 30 years. And then in that point, he was still being recognized as a member of LCN, as a member of the Philadelphia Mafia. I was told he was in a quasi-conciliary role. And that changed, though, in March of 2024. So like 6 months later, half year later, because Merlino went on the Vlad TV YouTube channel, which gets millions of views, that upset a lot of people. And that was kind of the final straw for what Jerry reported was a shelving. And I'm told that the guys in Philly have told Joey Merlino that he is out of the picture until he gives up the podcast. And at that point, I guess, for lack of a better expression, he can reapply. But just wanted to kind of square what was being kind of talked about over the last year and a half. Even more recently, there's been a lot of content about it. And then, kind of what the history is and what really was reported as opposed to what some people were saying was reported. But long history of New York being heavily involved in Philly mob leadership decisions, who takes over, who steps down, who is allowed to have power, who isn't allowed to have power. So if we're judging by just the historical record, the track record, the modus operandi, it'd be difficult to say it's surprising that New York exerted some authority in this controversy over the last year and a half with Merlino's podcasting. So I hope everybody enjoyed this first edition of OG History, which is going to be a new feature here at OG Pod. So hope everybody enjoyed. Please like, share, and subscribe. Scott Burnstein, OG Pod, uncovering the underworld, one city, one region, one country at a time.